All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to try to get all of the lectures out even before your papers are done. I'm not sure, I should be cutting it close. All right, so this lecture is going to be Chapter 8, The Challenges of Economic Development. This kind of stuff is way more my wheelhouse. I came up Econ, and I try to throw a lot of econ in my classes. I think it's excellent for you to learn economic theory without all of the stupid curves and graphs and marginal shaded areas and that's awful. But we can talk high level econ without all that stuff. So I hope we can get some of that economic theory across, because the further you go in political science, and especially sort of comparative or international relations science, you need to know about international economic trends and theories and comparative advantage and Ricardo and Keynesianism versus Adam Smith and all this kind of stuff, right? So I really like to establish that. All right. I'm going to take my own advice. I'm always pushing all of you to add more sort of visuals and this sort of stuff. So I'm going to really try to pump out more slides moving forward. So I hope you enjoy the slides for this lecture. It's going to be a mix of the book and stuff that I've learned myself. All right, here we go. First, there are numerous historical reasons why the Middle East struggles with economic development. These include first geography, of course, and the difficulties of agricultural development. If you're in Oman or Saudi Arabia, there are real struggles, right, to try and grow crops, given the remarkably minimal rainfall and the sort of desert arid land, right? So that makes economic development difficult. The geography of the place and just sort of the widespread nature of some of the countries. Again, Saudi Arabia is a great example. It is enormous. There's not a lot of infrastructure to get out to the broader, external regions and things like this stuff. And so that also makes it difficult because, say you're Norway, or, I mean, even in the Middle East, say you're Jordan, some very small country, you might have rural areas, but you're mostly urbanized. It costs you per mile of road far more for your sort of regional infrastructure expenditures per person than it does in a small country like Jordan, right? And so, like, you're not getting as much bang for your buck if you're building out road systems in Saudi Arabia versus road systems in Jordan. All right. We also have problems with water access, right? And this is the water stress ratio on slide 1. You can see the Middle East in particular tends to be the most acute region on the planet when it comes to water access, especially with rising populations. It is very difficult in this area in Iraq, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, Egypt. Almost the entire region struggles with this, right? And so that means, big proportions of your expenditures are going to water access and that kind of infrastructure and things of that sort. They also have what's called the resource curse, which we'll talk about extensively in this chapter. The resource curse means a lot of different things, right? This either extractive or rentier economies, which are very similar, but there's some differences we'll talk about. It means that you don't need to diversify your economy, and that ends up meaning that the state has more leverage when there's only a small handful of sectors in your economy, right? Versus, say, a Europeanized or American economy that has powerful people in so many different sectors, right? That it would be really hard to just take complete control of the economy. There's no real need to please the citizens, right? So the accountability of the sort of Rousseauian, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract where, okay, yes, the citizen does have responsibilities to the state, right, to follow the laws and these sorts of things. But the state also has responsibility to the cities, to the citizens, and this contract is sort of severed because the state doesn't rely on keeping the citizens happy, right? It can create and function its own bureaucratic apparatus without taxes, and removing this accountability mechanism of keeping the citizens happy so that they will pay your taxes so that you can run your government and keep keeping your citizens happy and ad infinitum is disconnected. There's very little need or want, even sometimes, for human development, right? So things like training or education, oftentimes these are very restricted or controlled or manipulated, etc., because the state, in some sense, doesn't need a broad, diverse, booming economy. But in a second sense, they don't want to train rebels who will question the state later. You also finally get really high levels of corruption, right? And this is because the state can write rules around profit sharing and control, and they also, as we'll learn, control most of the bureaucratic entities, which are enormous compared. We'll talk about that too, right? All right. Finally, they were kind of late to the game when it came. Not finally. There's another slide, I think. They were late to the game when it came to industrialization. Industrialization really kick-started around, the London European region, and then exploded in the U.S. And they, in a sense, even left the Europeans behind eventually. But Europe had been pretty substantially industrialized coming out of all of their colonial extraction, right? And in some sense, all of that sort of colonial extraction and then use of those products for things like rubber and energy and metals, etc., allowed them to leave much of the rest of the world behind, right? And so the Middle East was left behind, like much of the rest of the world, but it also has sort of structural issues that make it even harder for them to catch up. Let's see. Oh, ISI, we've talked about that before in this class. Remember, there was basically like, okay, the industrialized states, and then for everyone who was left behind, there were really two options: export-oriented economics, or what's called ISI, import substitution industrialization. And in many sense, they started out the same, right? They're all starting to kickstart, they're all trying to kickstart some sort of industries. And then, but the pivot was where South Korea, Japan, China, etc., um, eventually took those to market and wanted to be internationally competitive, right? And they held their companies that they doled out money to higher standards than did the ISI set. And so they moved toward exports and international competition, and then wanting to roll that into increasing the level of technological advancement, manufacturing chips, etc. Right? The on the sort of opposite side of that, the antithesis was the ISI set, import substitution, where they put up huge trade barriers. They doled out massive state largesse to these very chosen industries, right? And then they blocked any other goods from coming into their countries so that they could develop their own internal markets, right? But that didn't really play well in the international scene, and it causes real problems, like it cuts out the sort of incentive for reinvestment in your technology and human capital. Um, you don't have to face competition, so you don't actually innovate anything. And so you can not only point toward the Middle East here, but in a sense maybe Russia, even though they took a very different approach. But Latin America, especially like Brazil, And this seemed to have been a major shift post World War II in how did your state do coming out of it, 80 years later. And the export oriented economies did well and are, in many senses, sort of driving the contemporary economic explosion. And the ISI countries all got sort of left behind and ended up in mass debt because they were just doling out to these poorly run industries. And so, yeah, it became a problem. All right, enough on that. Let's see. Um, okay, we'll move to the next slide. So, slide 2, challenges of development number 2. We talked about colonialism and extraction. I'll just skip over that. We also have a lot of religious and secular tensions, right? And so we talked in the intro about how Islam was sort of a unifying force moving out of, especially the death of Muhammad around sort of the 630s, right? And in a sense, it helped many of the empires sort of, I don't know, extend their influence more than they may have been able to because of through just political and bureaucratic means, right? But in the modern age, I guess, moving out of World War II again, Islam has become a bit of a schism in much of the Arab societies, right? You see frustrations and attacks in Egypt, in Yemen, in Syria, Lebanon for a while, right? Israel, Palestine, like, and so, and that one's not inter-Islam versus secular, but there's a lot of seething gaps in their society, right? Where you get sort of Kemalist secularism versus Khomeini's, theocracy. And there's a lot of rifts in each of these states, not every one of them, but a lot of them in the modern period. Okay. We also have very tenuous politics, right? So we've had many dictatorships, many coups d'etat, right? You've had multiple assassinations of not only sort of the state leader, but also lower level leaders or apparatchiks or bureaucratic members, etc. You've got a lot of guns versus butter, right? Instead of trying to pay to support I don't know, a growing middle class, you get rising expenditures and pretty massive expenditures in the military, right? Not only because of what we'll talk about later, the state's providing jobs. So, in that sense, you can't question the state because your job relies on it. But also tensions between countries, but also, you know, also tensions with the outside world. Also, sort of the U.S. supporting states like Saudi Arabia in the modern era in helping us sort of fight proxy wars in places like Syria and Yemen. And so there's a lot going on here with the military expenditures, but you can see at the bottom of the slide sort of what is the average military expenditure as a percent of GDP, right? And in the US, I think we're at like maybe 4%. I should check that number actually. And, Trump has been really pushing NATO to get above first 2%, and now they've promised 5% of their GDP. But these numbers are pretty remarkably high, right? So Iraq, yes, they have high expenditures coming out of, the Iraq War, of course. Iran at almost 4% of their total GDP, Saudi Arabia exploding at 10%, Libya at 7%, Egypt at, what is this? 2%. I guess that's not so high. And, Israel, of course, has high military expenditures. So, yeah, you could see here, like, they're disproportionately spending on military output, military technology, military boots on the ground, rather than sort of social domestic spending, infrastructure, build outs, these sorts of things, right? There's always what we call an opportunity cost in economics, where what every single decision you make has alternate decisions that could have been made, right? And we're looking for the peak outcome, the Nash equilibrium, um, utility maximization, whatever you want to call it, right? Okay, let's see. Oh, we also get high levels of human suppression, right? Human rights suppression. And this sort of touches on earlier about, not wanting to fully educate people sometimes, or being unwilling to educate women sometimes, or a lot of these sorts of things. And you also get, control over internet access, what kind of information is being accessible, right? And the more you do that, the worse your outcomes are going to become, because your citizens are unable to get sort of a true picture of the way the world works, right? And this also actually tends to lead to more sort of assassinations and coups d'etat, etc. All right, neocolonialism, I think, is has been a problem. Post World War II, we purportedly moved away from trying to control other states' sovereignty and political outcomes, though this norm seems to be disappearing right now. But we saw the CIA influence places like Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Iran, with the one we talked about. You see these sort of debt traps that get created by states like the IMF, or by states through sort of bilateral lending, but also the IMF and the World Bank. There are these sorts of core versus periphery arguments, right? A very famous book by a guy named Wallerstein in political science says that the core states, I think this book was written in 1973, the core states, which would include sort of what we call developed today, um, uh, actually use their influence to ensure that periphery states never actually become core states, right? And so there's manipulation of things like that. We also get things like, man, what was it called? I'll get back to it. Okay, the final one, informal markets, right? And so, drugs are more of a problem in this region than most people realize, especially in places like Iran, Iraq, and Egypt. And then, if we want to include places like Sudan. And so, drugs not only come from Afghanistan, has historically been the world's largest heroin producer, but you also get drugs like hop from, in places like Egypt and Sudan, etc. And so, there can be some problems with drugs here, but you also have other informal markets, informal labor markets, uh, modern day slavery and labor trafficking, um, and also just tiny little stalls and stuff that no one really has on paper, no taxes are being paid, who knows about the safety of the products, like all kinds of different stuff, right? Okay, I think that's it for this. So we'll move to slide 3, and we'll move into a discussion of statism. Okay, so the assumption moving out of World War II basically was statism. And in French, this is étatism, right? Because état is the state, right? That's where coup d'état comes from. The assumption is that we need to move to statism, right? We've been left behind by sort of the colonial project and then industrialization. We must sort of catch up as quickly as we can. There's so much poverty that very few, at least citizens, have the money to be able to actually transform new sectors or companies or whatever it might be, right? And so the state has a duty to play a role in um, controlling the economy, right? And this is in many ways a little later than the US, which went through this, really starting, I'd say, with like, um, man, what is his name? Teddy Roosevelt, right? But then really strengthening it post or during at least the Great Depression, right? And so you start to get some state control over the economy moving into World War II. It was a little later in the Middle East, especially because of the sort of lingering existence of the empire and the empires and stuff like that. But state-owned enterprises step in, and the idea here basically is that okay, normal citizens can't afford to build these huge industries that we need, so the state is going to do so and either have direct control over the company uh, or industry, whatever it might be, or we will have some sort of statist slash private meshing, right? And again, this is sort of ISI. We're going to put up big barriers to foreign goods. We're going to dump a bunch of money into these hand chosen industries that we want to see succeed. And we'll sort of build our own domestic markets. But it was a kind of a crippling failure. Uh, Again, we had sort of moved that way in the West, starting with Teddy, moving into FDR, but also all across Europe as we see sort of depressions and these periodic boom and bust periods. You're getting bread lines. And this is also leading to things like fascism and Nazism, and anti immigrant stuff and anti Semitism, etc., right? And so Keynes comes along and says, look, this isn't working. We need to put money into people's hands so that we can sort of buy the products that we need factories to make. And it was a real whole turnover of the entire economic thought, right? But just quote unquote, the invisible hand at this point had sort of lost its guild, I guess, right? Like people were starting to see the real cracks of just allowing the invisible hand of the market to hold sway over entire national economies, right? And so not only did you get the rise of communism and Marxism and this entire idea that states are just, I don't know, giant profit soakers up, right? Not only did you get communism, but you start getting like real, like, I don't know, centrists even saying, like, look, this is not working. The invisible hand caused the Dust Bowl. It's caused these breadline problems. It's caused massive unemployment and inequality and abuse of labor and all of these sorts of things, right? And so you really get this whole new paradigm on the scene. Okay, I think that's a really great point to stop this one, and then I'll jump into the rest as we move forward. All right, thank you so much.